Hey, Joe, that old guy's made another YouTube video. You want to watch it? It's probably crap. I might check it out anyway. Hey, it's Mark Green again, and I'm going to take a break from my clock and show you how I made this serving tray out of a hunk of old wood. I had some wood from an apple tree that grew in our yard. My daughter used to climb in it. That's why it's sentimental wood. It's been sitting in my shop for over 20 years, so it's good and dry. I need to flatten it and turn it into some thin lumber. When I cut the tree down years ago, I made a mistake and the pieces are very thin in spots. Plus, it has warped as it dried. My plan is to use this CNC router I built. This is the Ox CNC router design from Open Builds. I'll use the CNC to flatten one side, and then I'll use my 13-inch planer to create some nice pieces of lumber. Often people use a router sled to do the flattening. I don't have a router sled, but I do have the CNC router, so I thought I'd give that a try. After I make the lumber, I plan on resawing the pieces to get some thin wood. So I'm going to put this flattish side down on the router bed and remove material from the wavy side and try and get it flat. So the piece of wood needs to be secured to the router table so it doesn't move around as the router goes back and forth planing the surface. And there's probably 100 ways to do this. I chose to clamp it on one end with a couple of bar clamps, and it's pretty rock solid. But when I did that, it elevated this end, which isn't what I want, and that's because there's a spot back there that's a little bit higher than everyone else, so it's kind of acted like a lever and moved this thing up. So I'm going to flip the wood over and try and use the CNC router to take that little bit off, and then I'll flip it back around the way I have it now. I'm just going to mark the area where that's in contact. So that's where the actual contact point is. And I probably want to move wood out to here and over to here.
Alright, I've got my respirator on. I really need one of these things. At least I do. It saves my lungs from a lot of sawdust. I think I've got this thing set up, but I'm going to fire this up and see how it works.
Okay, looks like it removed that big lump. I'm going to flip it over and see if it lays flat the way I want it to. Okay, I think that's a little bit better with that big lump out of the way. It's still not laying completely flat against the board, but that's to be expected, I guess, because that's one of the things we're trying to address, is the fact that it doesn't have a flat edge. So now I'm going to go ahead and try and do the pass down the full length of this board, or at least as much as I can reach with this particular CNC router. Okay, I'm ready to do the first pass. I manually set mechanical 0 by jogging the router to here. I'll do one pass, then jog the router down for subsequent passes. That way I can use the same G-code throughout the process. This is one disadvantage in using a CNC router instead of a router sled. The CNC router, at least in the initial pass, spends a lot of time just moving through the air, which is wasted time. Had I used a router sled, you would just skip those spots and move on to the points where the router engaged with the wood. That pass just barely started to kiss the wood there. So I'm going to go ahead and set a new 0 down about 5 millimeters from this 0, and then it should cut a whole bunch off of this piece of wood. Okay, that took 10 minutes, over 10 minutes, and clearly a router on a on your own router sled would have been a lot faster, because there's a big section here that it didn't do anything, but you have to sort of let the CNC program do its thing. So you have no choice but to just sit there and waste your time and watch it do nothing. Okay, so after, I didn't even count the number of passes I did, but it looks pretty flat. Made a whole bunch of wood chips, that's for sure. In fact, made a big mess. But let's just check it and see how flat it looks. And it's looking pretty good. I think it did the job. And I'm starting on the second piece of wood. Again, here's one of the big problems with not having a sled. Spending a lot of time just moving through the air. Okay, as with the first piece of wood that I did, I removed a big lump here, and I'm hoping that this part of the wood will lie reasonably flat against the router table. This piece of wood is so twisted that I'm afraid that when I surface this and make a flat piece, I'm going to be lucky to have a half of an inch thick, which is too thin for me to make what I want. But let's give it a shot. Well, this has a lot of dead time doing nothing, but I've got to let it run, because I think by the time I get down here, it's going to start engaging with the wood again. So I got nothing but time on my hands. I'm going to go ahead and take this guy, cut off this end, run that through the planer, and see what I get. Yeah, so that pass did not only cut here, but did start to touch the surface there and touch the surface there. So unfortunately, I've got to let the program run the whole time, even though it's mostly just running in the air. I'll show you how I prepare for each pass. Right now, I've set the router back to mechanical 0, so it's the 0 that I defined. And then I just come over to chili pepper and move the Z-axis down by 3 millimeters. And I set that as the new mechanical 0. So now, when it does the next pass, it'll take 3 millimeters more off of the wood. All right, it took about 5 passes. It's not quite surfaced here, but that's okay. I believe that from here to the end, I'll have enough wood, and I'd rather retain as much thickness as I have, which it's actually looking pretty thin. So I'm going to go ahead and plane this. Well, here's my 2 planed pieces of wood. I didn't plane this one all the way down here. I really need to get enough wood from right into there. Still got some rough spots, but I'm really worried about the thickness. My plan on this piece is to resaw it, which is going to be a bit of a challenge, and get 2 thin pieces of wood out of it. So I need to leave enough there so that when I resaw it, I've got some wood that I can run through the planer. And this one, as you can see, is full of unexpected wormholes on both sides. And it's really badly split here. And that showed up as some internal splits when I played it. I'm going to try and work around that. And I think for this, I'm going to try something I've seen other people do, and that is fill it with epoxy. So that'll be something fun. And I think before I fill it with epoxy, I'm going to go ahead and square these up into some, what I would call a regular lumber shaped piece of wood. So there's a whole bunch of wormholes here with debris in them, and I'm gonna just go ahead and try and use this anyway. I'm going to try and clean that out with whatever I can. Right now I've got a big old pointy tool. I'm going to clean it out, and then I'm going to fill it with epoxy. See what it looks like. Really thinking I was going to clean these out, fill it with epoxy resin, and then cut it down to size. I think that's going to be a mistake because I'm sure that when I cut it down to size, I'm just going to expose more holes. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is try and cut it into appropriate lengths, and then we'll see what it looks like. The narrower piece of wood had a reasonably straight edge on this side, and I used it to cut this edge, and then I moved the fence by 1/8 of an inch and recut this edge. And, I think I've got a reasonably straight pieces of wood with a lot of flaws in it. Still see if I can figure something out. Now this one doesn't have any straight edges, so what I'm going to do is scribe a line on it and cut it on the bandsaw. Hopefully I'll get a reasonably straight edge and that I can run against the fence on my table saw, see if I can't get a decent piece of wood out of this. My handy dandy 4-foot straight edge. I've had this thing for decades. There's two pieces like this, you join them together and you can draw a straight line on a piece of plywood, which that's really quite nice. Actually, you can run a saw against this edge, so it's really good. Anyway, I've drawn a straight line there. I'm going to try and follow that line with my bandsaw. Okay, we've got a reasonably straight edge there. Let's see how it, I think it's good enough for a first cut on the table saw. Flip it over and do a second cut, and I should have two pretty good parallel lines. I was going to resaw both pieces using my table saw. Wider piece of wood won't fit in my bandsaw. And I've in the past not had much luck with bandsaw. With that, the blade always seems to curve when it's in the wood. But I just repaired my bandsaw. I found that it had a broken pulley, and I replaced that. Decided to go ahead and give it a shot. I think this worked out pretty well on the bandsaw. And again, it did expose some worm holes that didn't know were going to be there. But I think maybe I can get just enough wood out of this. I was hoping to get 3/8 of an inch, but it's getting a little narrow for that. I cleared the debris out from the wormholes using a toothpick mostly. I figure that it's hard enough to break up the leftovers that the worms left, but soft enough it won't damage the apple. Okay, and the deeper and parts that had more of this stuff in it, I got out my trusty, I think this is a letter opener, but it lets me put a little bit more force on it. I'm resawing the wider piece of wood using the table saw, and the reason I'm using that instead of my bandsaw is that this is too wide to fit in my bandsaw. I'd have to cut it down, and I want to keep as much of this wood as I can. Okay, I have never generated as much smoke in my life cutting a piece of wood. And I need the blade to be a little bit bigger or higher because I didn't cut all the way through. Interesting. I thought about raising the saw blade and finishing the cut, but I think to get that little bit extra, I'm just going to use the handsaw and finish cutting this into 2 pieces.
Let's see why this looks so bad. Man, that burnt something fierce. Well, I'm hoping when I run this through the planer, that one's awfully thin. I'm hoping I have at least a 1/4 of an inch piece of wood.
I'm going to take my first attempt ever at filling in voids in wood with epoxy. I'm going to start out with a suggestion made by a YouTuber. I watched a few videos of his. He does a lot of epoxy tables, Blacktail Studios. He said you should test your colorant just using water, because water's clear like the epoxy, and you should end up getting about the same result. Okay, I've got 4 of these things of water in here, which is about as much epoxy I think it's going to take for me to fill the voids. I got a little bit of black, and I'm going to start out with maybe this rose red, and I want to just make it a little bit darker. Let's try that much red, that much black. Nope, that is too black. This is probably about the 8th try I've got. I'd really like to get a deep red. Every time I add black to this, I get purple. So I did red and then sort of an opposite color, yellow, and that made it okay. And then I darkened it with a little bit of black. It's not exactly the color I'm looking for, but I think I'm going to go with it. So everything I'm doing on this project, there's probably a dozen different ways to do it. That's one reason I named my channel One Possible Solution, because I'll bet there's hundreds of ways really you could do this. There's probably the fastest way, there's probably the optimal way or the best way, but this is my way, and I don't claim that it's either the best, the fastest, or whatever. But because this goes all the way through, I had to create really a dam, and I've done that with a piece of tape. I hope that's going to work. And a lot of these little bug holes, I don't know if these are worms or termites, they go all the way through to the back side, so I've had to make sure that nothing flows out the back, tape that up, and now let's try and mix up some colors and hope that it gets to be sort of okay. But I'm using this KHD, and they give you these really fancy little cups, hard to dig out. I'm going to mix this in a clean cup, and like all epoxies, it's 1-to-1 resin and hardener. I honestly didn't think I'd need gloves to do this, but I'm glad I've got them on now. I'm a little bit worried that being so viscous, it's not really going to flow through the insect holes very well, and they're pretty intricate, these holes, and I'm afraid that I'm going to end up with voids. And so when I cut this wood down to size, I might actually end up exposing voids, and then I'm going to have to figure out how to deal with that. I think that's about how much I had in my test. Now, just a wee bit of black, not very much. Maybe that much. Okay, that's my pigments. Now, everybody says you got to mix this for about 5 minutes. So here we go, 11:53. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. 4 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna live dangerously. 4 minutes. Now, let's see if I can do this. I've got to try and fill these little holes. I have no idea if these are going in. I know this particular one goes way deep inside. I pushed a pin in there, it goes in about a ½ an inch, so I'm sure I'm just trapping air in there. It's not going to do much good. For the rest, I'm just going to try and pour. I'm really hoping this flows through to the backside. Doesn't create a lot of voids. You can actually see it flowing. I really don't know what best practice is. I mean, if I was filling this with some kind of wood filler, I would be tempted to scrape this off with a putty knife. Otherwise, I'm going to have this hard thing I got to get rid of, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do it. I've only watched a couple of videos, but it seems like everyone else just fills it up and then scrapes it off when they're done. So what I might do is just let this go. Like 5 minutes, and then I think I'll maybe hit it with a torch, get some of these bubbles out. In fact, I'm not even sure why I should wait. I have no idea, so I'm going to go ahead and do it now. All right, all the cool kids on YouTube hit this with a torch. Get rid of the bubbles. Okay, the epoxy is set, hasn't been 24 hours. The tape came off really nicely. I'm quite surprised. This is the tape side. It's nice and flat. Now I need to flatten the side where I poured it. And this was what I've seen other people on TV do. And that is just go after it with a plane. So this is still quite soft still. Seems to be planing up quite nicely. Okay, I've planed it down, and now I'm just going after it a little bit with my cabinet scraper. Get the last little bit off. And I think this is something I haven't looked forward to, and that is that where it's overflowed, it's stained the wood, so I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with that. All right, the epoxy has been scraped and planed. Obviously, I got some junk going there I need to get off. I'm a little bit disappointed because I guess I didn't realize that it was going to stain the wood like that. But on one side, I've taken 2 passes, very thin passes with the planer, and it seems to get that surface layer out, so I'm going to do that on the other side. And whatever thickness wood I've got is the thickness of wood I'm going to live with. I've done very thin passes on both sides. I set my planer for 1/64 of an inch on cuts. And let's see what I've got. 0.348. So somewhere between 1/4 and 3/8. That's going to be okay. I was hoping for 3/8. I'm pretty close. I'm happy with that. Plus, by filling these voids with epoxy, it's giving me a little bit more usable wood. So I've got more options on what to do with it. Oh, look, there's a little pinhole there. Little pinhole I forgot to fill, one there too. That's okay, we'll live with those. All right, I epoxied up what's going to be the bottom of my tray. and I really wasn't happy with the joint where I put these together. I don't have a jointer. I could have run it through the table saw to get it straighter, but then I'd lose some width, and I really wasn't willing to give up that width. So I thought I'd just try and put some epoxy in there and maybe dress it up a little bit. Now all I've got to do is smooth out all that epoxy. So I'm going to use, like I did before, I'm going to use a little block plane and a cabinet scraper. This is interesting. I tried to plane that spot right here, and it's pushed epoxy over to there. So I'm guessing this epoxy isn't quite cured yet. So I'm going to let it sit for maybe another 6 hours and then come back and hit it again. Okay, I said I was going to let this cure for about 6 more hours, but I'm impatient. I think it's cured for about 4 more hours. I'm going to give it a shot and see if I can't scrape all this excess epoxy off. Plenty of epoxy shavings. I've let this sit another 24 hours because I found on this part, this piece here where I let it sit for 48 hours, it was way easier to scrape. And with just 24 hours, this stuff just isn't cured hard enough. And now that it's been 48 hours, I'm thinking it'll work much better. And I really like using these cabinet scrapers. Now, I noticed that this wood is, I've done something wrong here because, let me see if I can show you a picture. You can see that it's really not flat. So I can't use my flat scraper there. It actually just misses everything. But I can use my curved scraper and get it pretty down pretty much. I'm just going to try and get it down to a reasonable level so I don't have to rely on, so I'm going to run this through the planer, but I don't want to have to rely on the planer to do it. But this cabinet scraper, I'm telling you, is a great way to go. You can just easily pull very, very thin layers of this epoxy off. I think this is faster and easier to use than the plane. How bad this looks on what I intend to have be the top side of this, because this is the book mat side, and that burning I did, I've got my table saw set wrong or something. It really screwed it up. So I need to pass this through the planer a couple times, get rid of that, get rid of the rest of the epoxy. Let's see what it looks like. Now, I got some tear out right here, which isn't very pretty. I don't really have any solution to fix that. I've planed it down now to a very odd dimension, 5.5 millimeters. The back side, I'm not too worried about that. I think I'll probably scrape this a little bit. I'm just going to live with that. That's going to be on the bottom, so hopefully no one will mind that. But I think it actually looks pretty nice. Here, let's try it like that. There we go. I like that. Looks pretty good, I think. Yeah, that attempt to fill my little gap there with epoxy was kind of a waste of time. I'll never do that again. Just try and get a cleaner edge than I've got right here. A jointer. If I had a jointer, it would have been better. All right, this chip out in the wood here, when I ran it through the planer, it's pretty bad. I don't think I can sand it. I mean, they're actually pretty deep. And it's just in this sort of one section of the wood. I thought about filling it with wood putty, but then I thought, you know, I've already used this epoxy everywhere else, so I'm going to try and actually put some epoxy on here. But this time, instead of just letting it sit in a big blob, I'm going to try and a little piece of wood to wipe it on. I let this sit for about 2 days, and I probably should have looked at it sooner. It really feels like all of that epoxy I put in there just sunk in, just soaked in. So I'm going to have to give this another coat and wait a couple more days. I overdid it. I spread it on with a piece of wood as kind of act like a spreader, and really wasn't sure the little holes were filled, so I daubed even more on because, you know, I found out you have to wait 48 hours to work with this. So I've already spent 2 days to get here. I want to make sure I get this done in the next 2 days. All right, I've gotten impatient, and it looks like actually this seems to be pretty solid after around 24 hours. It seems to be scraping fine, getting it off, so I'm going to go ahead and scrape it off today. Yeah, see, it's taking it off. You know what, that really does need to cure another day. While that's curing on the top side for one more day, I think I'm going to go ahead and start trying to sand the bottom side. No reason I can't do that. Nothing's going to get stuck in the epoxy now. Okay, I've gone over this with 120, like I said, to remove the excess epoxy and the glue. I went over it with 220, and now I've gone over it with 400 really quick. I didn't spend a lot of time. And it's when I went over it with 400, I started seeing these little dots of white in the epoxy. I thought, what are those? Is that something that the sander has just kind of pushed down onto the epoxy? No, those are pinholes caused by air bubbles. I didn't even know I had any air bubbles till I got to this point. I'm not going to do anything about them. I'm just going to call them a feature and finish over it. I'm hoping that 400 has made this smooth enough that it'll be shiny when I put a finish on. And to test that, here we go, moment of truth. I'm just going to put a little water on it and see if it looks shiny. Oh yeah, that's going to look nice. In fact, once that's on, you don't even see the little air bubbles. So, looks pretty golden. Today I'm going to start cutting the pieces of the tray from my finished wood stock. And what I want to cut first are the 4 edges that form the side of the tray. And for the handle ends, which curve up and have a hole for a handle, I'm going to use the CNC router. Now, I could use the CNC router to cut the entire piece out, but I end up with basically an extremely wide kerf then, which I don't want. So for the straight edges, I'm going to cut those either with my table saw or my band saw. The G code that I've written has the middle of the hole in the handle as being the 0 position. So I'm going to do a practice cut on this thin sheet of plywood, and I drew a line right down the middle of the wood, and I used the jog controls to move the bit so that it's in line with this and that it's 1 inch away, actually, yeah, 1 inch away from the edge. And now I want to just do a practice run with an elevated Z to see if it does the movements that I expect. So let's go. So this will be the initial cut for the top of the piece of wood. This will be obvious once I cut this part out. And this is the initial pass for the handle. So everything looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and reset the mechanical 0 so that it actually cuts this piece of wood, and we'll see what we get. Now we're cutting some wood. Well, that's one reason you do a practice cut. My fancy little clamp there didn't hold. Yeah, so I got to try it again. I think what I might do, these are some 3D printed clamps I made, and I'm worried to put too much pressure on them because I've had them break before. I like the concept of this hold down clamp. I got the design from Thingiverse, but I've broken 2 of these by putting too much pressure on them. And now maybe I didn't print them with enough infill, so I'm printing another one right now with 50% infill. We'll see how good that is, but I want to get on with this. So for now, all I've done is clamp down on a piece of wood. Now 3D printed knobs with a nut in them, I can put plenty of force on this. It doesn't break. It's this thing that's breaking. So I think with this thing on with some wood, held down with some wood, I think that's rock solid. I'm going to try it again. Well, that held it down better, obviously, and now you can see what the top of the end pieces on the tray are going to look like. So now comes the scary part, cutting the real wood. This is a multi-step process trying to set this up. So I had previously made a paper template that was roughly the shape of what I wanted to cut out, and it's actually 13 inches long when I thought I was going to get 13 inches for the bottom, but I'm only going to get 12. So this is actually a little bit bigger than it needs to be. I've lined it up where I think it'd be a nice place on the wood. It'll capture some of the wormholes, and I'm just going to mark the center line. Well, I've marked the center line for that piece. That will be where one of the axes needs to be 0 for the router. Now for the other one, I'm going to figure out where the center is by using the part I just cut out. I line it up with the center line. Let's see if I can do this. And then I'm just going to trace this hole, and that'll tell me where to put the router bit. Well, that didn't work. That's depressing. I don't have enough of this wood to really make another mistake. So I got to figure out a better way to clamp this sucker down. All right. I've got this thing bolted down now. Let's give it another shot. Okay, I figure I can get 2 17-inch lengths, 1 inch wide out of the other piece of wood, and one of these end pieces. So basically I'm going to throw a whole bunch of this piece of wood away. I'm going to get one good piece out of it. Let's give it a shot. The y-axis of the router got messed up on some passes, probably because the feed was too fast. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and try and cut this piece out on the bandsaw and figure out how to deal with this mess up. I'm going to cut this line on the bandsaw because this edge down here isn't parallel to that edge. I wasn't guaranteed when I got this in the router table that it was going to be lined up perfectly. I tried, but obviously didn't work. So I'm going to cut this shy of the line on the bandsaw, and then I'll either plane it or sand it up to that line to get the final piece. Well, at least something went right. This big split that I filled, I didn't know how far through I'd really gotten the epoxy bit. Check that out. It went all the way through to the other side. So yeah, that's one thing right for today. Okay, I've got 2 nice little sticks of wood. They have this interesting epoxy filled holes, and that should be good for the long edges. Now I just need to get the short edge with the handle cut. All right, I've got it set up to cut the last piece. I raised the mechanical 0 home point by 1 millimeter in Z because I noticed that it cut pretty deep in the spoil board. It doesn't need to cut that deep. Got them bolted down. Oh yeah, and on this code, I've reduced the speed. I cut it in half, and I've reduced the depth from 3 millimeters to 2 millimeters per cut. So let's try it. Oh, maybe not. Down to 2 millimeters now. Well, that turned out more like what I intended it to be like. To straighten out the bottom of the end pieces, which as you recall I cut with the bandsaw, I'm going to use this big disc sander on my Shopsmith. Yes, I have a Shopsmith. I have a very fine point on this pencil. And I'm using the fine point to mark exactly how far down that needs to be sanded. So I need to sand until I get down to the bottom of that line. So to manage this damage that happened when my router lost its mind, where I've got these different levels here, and basically an oversized hole at the top here, the proper size hole at the bottom, I'm just going to sand it up to this biggest opening. I'm just going to go ahead and sand this out. So I'm starting with a really coarse 60 grit drum. I'll just lock it in at this. Lock it in right here. Okay, I did a pretty good job of getting rid of that ridge. I just happen to have a bigger handhold than I originally intended. So I'll use the adhesive transfer tape. I've got these two guys stuck together, and now I'll just sand this one so that it looks like that one. And the nice thing about this is they'll both sand equal together. I'm going to try again. It's 229. I'm just going to scrape this until it looks like I see wood. I'll bore you the details. So the way a cabinet scraper works is you take a burnishing tool and run it along this edge at an angle, and you get a tiny little burr there. And I did that to this one the other day, and I think I pushed the burr down too hard, because in order to make this thing really work, I've got to come at I don't know, a pretty acute angle in order for it to really scrape. All right, my GoPro ran out of memory space, so I didn't capture everything I did, but I scraped this down for about a half an hour, and then I took sanded it just like I did the other side, starting with 120, 220, and then 400. And I kind of like this. Now this little bits where the wood tore out is full of little pink spaces. It adds something interesting to it, and it looks better than just having pits. I was going to round over the top edge, whatever edge I decide is top edge, on these with a router bit, and I was hoping to find a router bit that had a bearing that could follow the surface, and I would set it to maybe go halfway, but the problem is, I don't know if you can see this, that actually won't cut anything off. So I'm not really going to be able to do this with the router. In the past, I've just used this tiny little Stanley plane, which I always thought was kind of a joke, except it turns out to be really great for putting in just a very small chamfer on the corners of some wood. And so I'm going to chamfer the straight edges with this and chamfer the top sides of these pieces with this. I'm not sure what I'm going to do about the hole there. I might just go around with the sanding drum really lightly and put a small chamfer in it. There we go. Nice little curl. You know, if I'm going to have to sand these, I might as well just sand them. So this is where the Shopsmith works pretty good, because I can adjust the table to 45 degrees. Okay, I've set the table to 45. I'm going to put on my dust mask and sand these down. Okay, well, that's not super even, but I think it'll be okay.
That ATG was kind of a mistake. Double stick tape would have been better. I've got to get all this adhesive off.
Okay, the sanding is complete. Now I need to decide which side I want to be the inside and which I want to be the outside. And I'm just gonna, this one has a little pinhole there, so I'm gonna mark, and this is gonna be the inside. I'm just gonna put a little mark here so that I know to put the groove on that part. Yeah, I've set up the saw to cut a little curve in there. It's just over 1/8 of an inch deep and just shy of 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So I'll cut that. That'll be the first pass. It's only going to be, about 1/8 of an inch wide, which is about half of what I need, because I think that my bottom is about 5 millimeters thick, so I'll have to do 2 passes. So I expected this groove to be 0.125 inch, but it's 0.10. So I'm going to have to do 2 passes to get this to the right depth. So I'm going to do first pass. I'm just going to try and take half of a saw blade out of that. Third pass, 0.195. I need 0.225, let's say. So I need to go another 0.03. All right, let me set it up for that. Cuts are made. Let's see how it's going to fit. Well, that looks pretty good. Okay, tray bottom is cut. Now I need to miter the sides, and this part scares me because I'm never really very good with the miter saw at getting things perfectly right. I'm really nervous about this part because I've never been able to miter two things and get them to be exactly the same. But I marked one of these for the length I wanted. I held them up together with the centers aligned and marked the other one. So all I need to do now is miter these and make sure they end up being exactly the same length. That's much better. Operator error. All right, so those are lined up. Those are looking pretty good. I don't think I'm gonna get much better than that. I could try and take just a hair off of which one. Doesn't really matter, I guess. I need like a 64th or less of an inch off. All right, so I'll come down. Let's just try that. I don't think I'm any better than that. Having this big light helps. I don't think those are going to be right. Exactly the same. Let's see. You know what? That's pretty damn close. Okay, I've got that clamped up with a band clamp, and I gotta say, the miters look pretty good. This one's a little off. I'm just gonna leave it that way, I think. There's only one more thing I need to do before I glue this together and apply a finish, and that is laser engrave a nice message on the bottom. Here's the thing I see all the time. People will laser engrave or laser cut unfinished wood, and even with air assist, which is what I've got on my Sculpt Thin laser, you still get sort of black marks where the smoke runs out over onto the wood, and you can't clean it off. It's stained the wood. So if you really want a nice looking engraving, what you really need to do is finish the wood first, and then if there is anything that blows off of it, you can just wipe it down, and you end up getting a really nice clean engraving with none of that smoky, I don't even call it overspray. Anyway, it's not good. All right. The thing is that these miter joints are extremely thin. and I'm sure they will not hold over, let's say, 20 years. So I'm going to do glue in the joint. Not standard, but let's go. Okay, I've glued it up. I've got a band clamp around the tray. I gotta say, it's looking pretty good. I decided to use a wipe-on polyurethane to finish this. So I'm going to do it a couple coats. Okay, I've got 2 coats on the top, sort of, not quite 2 coats on this part of the bottom. It's a little rough. I'm just going to go over it real quick with some 400 grit sandpaper and do a 3rd coat. Okay, the tray is complete, including a nice engraving on the bottom. This was a fun project and I learned a lot. First, I need a better way to clamp stock to my CNC router. Second, I need to learn more about feeds and speeds. Third, using epoxy resin with wood is kind of fun. Fourth, old school cabinet scrapers are the way to go. I hope you enjoyed this video.